Hey there, everybody, this is John from Stand By for Adventure, and it's time to stand by for adventure. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that I've actually been thinking about quite a bit lately. Sorry, I'm just organizing my notes over here. And that is, well, what this video is going to be about in total is DM tips for coming up with a new campaign, sitting down with your players and planning it out, and making your PCs the heroes of that game. Um, One of the things, and there's a bunch of stuff to go over. I've kind of compacted it down into 4, 5, 6 different things, and they're all sort of interrelated. So let's just go through and start working on these. One of the big things that's come up in the recent years in gaming that's been formalized that hadn't really been formalized in the past is this concept of a session zero, where everybody sits down, the players and the GM sits down to talk out what they want the game to be like, how they want it to feel, how they like, is it going to be dark, is it going to be light, is it going to be funny, is it going to be are you all going to play a thieves guild, like members of a thieves guild? Are you going to be just independent characters that happen to get together and do things? Like, figure out all of that, right? Everything about the campaign. Figure out if any of your characters know each other, how they know each other, if they're close, if they're not very close, but they're acquaintances. There's tons of information that can be exchanged in this session zero meetup. Which can in fact take over an entire play session. However, for new GMs, I kind of recommend a session point 0.5, and I'll explain that. So in session 0, like I said, you talk about all sorts of different stuff. And in what I'm calling a session point 0.5, and maybe it is still a session 0, but it's a little different than that. The GM comes to the table and basically pitches, here's what I'm thinking. And I recommend this for first time or early GMs because in a completely free form session 0, you may end up agreeing to things that you know the players want that you might not be confident in your ability to handle once you actually get to the table. And rather than do it wrong or just not introduce those plot points at all during the game as you're playing, and thereby disappointing the player who or players who wanted them included. Just to help avoid that, right? That whole situation. Instead, what I would say is, as the GM, and get an okay from your players from this as well. That's the whole point of a session 0 or a planning session, whatever you want to call it, is show up to the table with an idea of what you want to do, of the type of game you want to run. And it could be anything from, I want to run a game. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be any game. It could be a Fate game. It could be the old Star Wars D6 system. It could be the old Ghostbusters game. It could be Starfinder or Pathfinder or Fantasy Age or the Chronicle system or Talislanta. I mean, like, there's all these possible games that are out there. Call of Cthulhu. You might have somebody at your table who just does not want to play one of those games. And if that is the case, that's going to be a no-go for you right off the bat. So if you show up and say, hey, I wanted to run a game of Mouse Guard, and one of the players is like, I don't want to play anthropomorphized animals, and I never read the comic, I don't get it, I don't understand it. And maybe you've got other people who are super excited about it, but because one of the players really doesn't know and really isn't into it, scrap that, come up with something else, come back to the table and pitch that. So when you do that, when you show up with your pitch, you want to have a few things planned out. And it doesn't have to be everything, but it wants to be, or what you want it to be is what you're comfortable with, so that you know when you show up to tell the players Let's use the Thieves Guild thing, which is on my mind just because I recently started a game set in the city of Sharn in Eberron for D&D, where I just said, everybody, you're all street level people who live in Sharn, and think of this as sort of a thieves guild game. You're not going to specifically be a member of a guild. You're basically a bunch of people who operate at that level, right? And they could join a gang, they could join a guild, they could go off on their own and do things, and that's kind of what they've ended up doing. Because that's the sort of game that I wanted to run, sort of a street level, everybody, morally questionable, a little bit iffy. I allow the players to kind of do whatever they wanted. If they wanted to go rob houses, they could. If they wanted to save the city, they could. And they've done some of both. But I came to them and said, this is what I'm thinking, are you guys in for that? And I know my players very, very well. And they were like, oh, yeah, that sounds fantastic. I love the idea of an urban setting. I love the idea of getting to play a character that I can kind of choose. Whatever I want to do, you're okay with. And as GM, I am okay with it. If they want to do nasty, evil stuff, we're all in our 40s, 50s. We can handle it, and I can handle it as a GM to kind of roll with all of that. You may not be that experienced and able to handle some of the things that players might want to do when they're left to their own devices entirely. But come to the table with an idea. I want to run a pirate game. I want to run a Underdark game, or Kyber in Eberron. I want to run a game where you work for somebody who has you trading on a flying ship that's going from one port to the next to the next. There won't really be pirates, but you'll get to do overland trade and deal with that sort of stuff. And that, having that sort of setup right from the beginning, gives you a strong idea of the sorts of stories you're going to have to come up with, and it gives the players a strong idea of what they're going to have to come up with. But more importantly, because you'll get that same thing out of a regular session zero, you will be pitching an idea that you already are interested in and have ideas for. Because ideas are going to be, I mean, it's the bread and butter of D&D, right? Like, you need to have a new plot line and a new plot line and a new plot line in order to keep the story moving and keep the characters advancing and keep the players interested and all that sort of good stuff. So don't just sit down for session zero and, as GM, say, I'll run anything you guys want, unless you know you can actually run what they're going to give you. If they decide that they want to play post-apocalyptic D&D setting that doesn't exist, so you'd need to make up everything off the top of your head, and when everybody sat down for session zero, they were like, there was some calamity, but it's not defined, and they were like, you can come up with something. Maybe you don't have a good idea, or you have an idea and then you come up with a better idea later, and then you're bummed that you didn't come up with it earlier because now the first idea is canon. Like, have an idea, come to the table, say, these are the things I'm interested in running. What do you guys think? And see what they give you back. I highly, highly recommend that for early GMs, because D&D can be very challenging, and you want to be able to tap into the subject matters and the plots that you like and you can come up with pretty fluidly. I, for instance, should not run cyberpunk style games. I'm just not good at them. I'm not. I don't know why. I've run them in the past and I don't like them. I don't like how they work out. Fantasy is totally my speed. Superheroes is more my speed. So I just don't do cyberpunk. I don't, and maybe I should and get better at it, but that's fine. It doesn't appeal to me that much that I feel like I need to get better. The other thing to think about, after you have everything set up, you've talked to the players, they've bought into the idea that you've pitched them, You've had some discussion, which you should absolutely, even in this point 5 session, some discussion of what their characters are going to be, what races, what classes, what sort of feats or special abilities, if, talk about all that sort of stuff. If you are using a pre-written adventure, this is kind of point number 2, something you'll need to remember if you're coming off of watching streaming shows like Critical Role is pre-written adventures typically, very almost always, are big plots that are going to happen to the PCs as they are moving through the adventure, but they aren't necessarily important to the actual plot. This is unlike things I mentioned, Critical Role, unlike Critical Role because you won't get an adventure that's like when Vox Machina had to go deal with Percy's storyline in Whitestone. You're not going to get, because there's a lot of personal buy-in there. The character and the player were very, very invested. And that sort of like intermingling of character and game really only arises from the GM and the player being on the same page, the player supplying the GM with something to work from, and the GM then coming up with a story that meshes it all together into the game to create, really, in Percy's case, just a fantastic few sessions. I thought that was a great section of Critical Role. But it's the same thing for Keyleth. All of her visits to the different elemental places, those weren't pre-written adventures. Matt was making that stuff up, and maybe he cribbed from, this adventure or that adventure for certain setups when it comes to like a battle location or something like that, which is entirely possible that he may have done. But they weren't pre-written adventures that said one of the player characters will be a druid who will have to go through an Aramente. Like, that was all made up. That was not... And so you won't get that experience out of a pre-written adventure if that's the thing you're looking for. So if you want that, just know running a D&D game, running a D&D adventure, a pre-written adventure... and again, I will put out the disclaimer that this is specifically for D&D, but you can kind of apply these lessons to any sort of role-playing game. It's very infrequent that you'll run into an adventure that puts a player character or a couple of player characters in a linchpin role, basically, where... they're the person that the bad guys are trying to get. And that's because it's pretty easy to get a character if you want to. Like, and in fact, the storyline with Percy is a good one because the bad guys, I won't give away the whole story, the bad guys who disliked him didn't necessarily care about him specifically, even though he cared about them specifically. So he wanted to get revenge on them, he wanted to get back at them, he wanted to take his home back, and they viewed him as like, oh, you poor little lost soul, how did we miss you for all this time? And that was very character driven. That was not adventure driven at all. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're looking for the Matt Mercer Critical Role type of interaction in your game where the player is at the center of what's going on, you probably aren't going to get that in a pre-written adventure, so don't rely on those to give you that experience. You will need to make that up. You can introduce that sort of thing into a pre-written adventure, entirely possible, but it will take some work, it'll take some creativity, and it'll take some effort. Not impossible, though. And again, Same thing in campaign 2, the stuff with Ford and Ukutoa, the stuff with Jester and the Traveler and Traveler Con. Like, that's not an adventure. Matt's coming up with that based on what the character or what the players gave him about their characters. And if you want that experience, your GM, or if you are the GM, you will have to come up with those sorts of things. So it's just something to keep in mind. One of the things that I also want to talk about is you do want to make your player characters the heroes of the setting. And this is something that people talk about a lot, but they don't get into a lot of the specifics. I think it's pretty obvious when you're sitting around a table with 2, 3, 4, 5 other people that they're the ones who are the stars. They're doing stuff. They're making things happen in the world. And not only do you want them to be at the center of attention in terms of the adventure you're running, but you also want to make them seem like they stand out in some significant way. And as an example, and then this is just like a couple of different ways you could do that, perhaps your setting has these 5 races, and I actually have some more images here that I can flash through. So Call of the Netherdeep, I'll jump back to that one, but you can run through, you have 5 different races. Let's say you've got halflings, orcs, humans, elves, and tieflings. And those are the 5 races that you've decided to use in your setting. And you make it clear to the other players, these are the 5 most common races. You can be any one of these, that's not a problem, go for it. If you want to play something else, say you want to be a Yuan-Ti, or you want to be a Kenku, or a Kokra, Aarakocra rather, the GM says, yeah, you can do that. That's fine. You just come from somewhere else. You are absolutely unique to the setting. People have heard of your kind, haven't necessarily seen one of you before, or you're completely new to them. And this kind of is a throwback to storylines like, in some movies they'll have like a Native American character, or if they're from Canada as opposed to the United States now, First Nations, but they've come over to the West, Western Europe, and they're unusual there. And that sort of thing did happen in actual history for all sorts of really messed up reasons. But allowing that makes your character that much more special, or makes that player's character that much more special, because it's not one of those 5 races. It's not one of the things that's expected. Same thing with the classes. Maybe all the classes exist, right? But maybe certain subclasses don't exist. Maybe your character who is a you decide to play a Githzerai sorcerer, like the one I described in a previous video. Githzerai do not fit in the 5 races. That's not one of the 5 that we had picked out for this. But yeah, you can play a Githzerai. I think that sounds cool. And at higher levels, I can, as GM, I can start doing some planar travel sorts of things that your character would at least have some sort of a clue about. I don't have psionics in the setting, like I wasn't thinking about doing that. But you know what? You want to play a Githzerai Aberrant Mind Sorcerer? Yeah, let's do it, because it'll be cool and different and new, and everyone will treat it as special as it should be because you're the only one. And that's the sort of make your player characters the star sort of thing that we're talking about here. We want to be able to make the players feel special and make it feel like they stand out and are unique and interesting. Sorry, I put together a bunch of images here on a slideshow just to have something to show as we're talking about all of this. And I find this to be a really interesting way to sort of customize your game world. I started running a game last year or so, and instead of using any of the normal races in the player's handbook, I said, here are the 5 or 6 races, and I took them from all sorts of supplemental books. So there was like the Simic Hydrid and the Vidalcan, Yuan-Ti, Bugbears, and the Yuan-Ti were basically the replacements for humans, the previously named purebloods. But everybody else, like, you wouldn't run into a halfling, you wouldn't run into an orc, you wouldn't run into even a human. They just weren't in this part of the world. Maybe all those races were somewhere else, but in this part of the world, that's not what was there. And anyway, it just allows you to kind of customize things and give your whole campaign a different feel. You should absolutely be trying to make the player characters feel special. That is, after all, why you are all sitting around the table, is they are the heroes of the play / movie / game that you are all putting on as you sit around the table. The other thing you talk about in these first sessions, session 0, session 0.5, as I was referring it to, is also figuring out what sort of style and scope that you want to have. How big is the game? Is it street-based? Is it super epic high fantasy? Is it really dirty, low magic, grimy Black Company style, Game of Thrones style before it gets all crazy and magical? You know, how do you want it to feel? What sort of descriptions are you going to be giving as GM? And believe me, descriptions go a long way in terms of adding flavor and character to your game. Again, talking about things like from Critical Role, when they do the how do you want to do this, the rules don't really matter. The players and the GM both know you've successfully hit or they've successfully failed to save and taken enough damage to take them out. So just make up how you want that final move to look. And if it's like super awesome magical, you're spinning fire out of your hands and spitting ice out of your mouth, great. The special effect doesn't make any difference other than the sort of feeling and power it evokes and the fact that it makes your character look and you feel awesome. It's just a great way to approach that. That, I think, is a fantastic thing to do. But you do want to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of like the morality of things. You don't want to bring a professional barber actually a barber would be good because it could be a surgeon of some type, but you don't want it like my character is the chief cook and bottle washer, and I don't really want to be an adventurer. Well, then don't be here. We don't want your character here. We want somebody who wants to go out and do things. And if you're reluctant at first, that's fine, but you need to actually deliver and show up to be a character and a player in the game. Something that I used a lot growing up playing games in college especially and thereafter is what we referred to as an open world versus a closed world. This can also be really good for new players and new GMs and people who want to be new GMs. So, as an example, a closed world would be, I come to the table, we sit down, come up with what the adventure, what the world is going to be, the setting is going to be, what the adventure is going to be. Maybe we've decided to run through the Ravenloft adventure book. that's my game. I run it. I'm the only one who runs it. And I would call that a closed world because nobody else gets to be the GM for that game. In something like an open world, which is the other term that we used, any of the other players could run a game in the setting. So, for instance, I'll go back to the Sharn game that I'm running in Eberron, obviously. I made it clear to the other players, like, hey, I'm going to write up a character for this. And if any of you, and the other players, or the other characters, the other players I told this to, if any of you want to run this at some point, I'm going to have a character, and you can just feel free to run something because the setup of the campaign was free-form enough that we were street-level thugs and thieves that somebody else could come up with a plot line, and a couple of people have done so. And as long as we're not stepping on each other's toes in terms of the overarching plots, that's fine. And it's nice because it's nice for new GMs, somebody who wants to experiment with being a GM, because they don't have the pressure of coming up with an entire setting on their own and managing the entire world. If for instance I'm a brand new GM running in an open world that my buddy Dave created, if I have a question about the world, I can look to Dave and say, I'm not sure what the answer is to that. Like, do you know, in the case of Eberron, like, can you tell them, the rest of the players, about what Upper Dura is like? And then Dave, who's way more familiar with Eberron and Sharn than I am, can say, oh yeah, Upper Dura is one of the huge towers in Sharn. It's a fairly nice neighborhood, like big section of the city, but it's not the nicest section, and it's not the nicest section of this tower. If it's near this place and that place, and they could go into a lot more detail, but that takes some of the pressure off you as a new GM to have to know everything. All you need to do is concentrate on telling the story you came to the table to tell. Hopefully it's just a one shot, so that you can kind of get your feet under you and see what it's like and see what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with. And then if you make it a short enough adventure, meaning a one shot, the next game you don't have to GM. Dave gets to GM again, and then you can play and think about, like, oh, okay, I've got some ideas now. Maybe I'll run another game sometime. I really, really encourage that sort of play, especially if the open world sort of play, especially if you have a table full of people who are new to gaming, and at least one of them wants to learn how to GM as well. Just say, hey, next time you want to run something, are you ready? There you go. That's all it takes. And if they're not, they're not. Then you keep running. But if they want to run something, they do. They have somebody to rely on to answer some rules questions, to answer some lore questions, things like that. It's a super, super useful way of doing things. As a brief side note, quite a few years ago, my friends and I, we had a pretty big gaming group of 6, 7, 8 people. We actually did a round robin game where every session, which quickly became every story arc, a new GM would take over, and we just played the same characters, but every few sessions we'd have a new GM who started a new little plot line, and it was great fun because they would bring in crazy random things, because that's how we had created the setting to be able to do that. And everybody ran a completely different feeling game, even though it was still in the same setting with the same characters, and it was a lot of fun. So that's also something you could try. Another really important thing to discuss, and there's a huge spectrum on this, is how much of a board game do you want to play versus how much of a radio drama do you play, or a theatrical play do you play. D&D and tabletop role-playing started, and I've mentioned this in a previous video, is I've got a whole bunch of guys here and they're all moving around on the map, and I want to know about this one guy. Like, he looks cool. I want to know more about him, so I'm going to start making up stories about him. And then that spread to become role playing in general, and now role playing has started to, and it's been doing this for a long time, move so that there's this huge spectrum that I just mentioned of a board game all the way to play acting. And you're going to need to figure out with your players, where on that scale are you? Are you somebody who likes to really get into character and spend a lot of time talking in character, or does your table prefer a little bit of that, but please make sure we have combat every game because that's really fun and exciting and we like that a lot. Um, and it could be anywhere in there. And maybe you have one player at the table who's like, nope, I just want combat. All I want is combat. The only time they're invested is when there's combat. And as long as you're okay with that person sitting there and not really being all that involved when the other players are role playing, and that player is okay with it too, that's fine. I have players like that. They just don't particularly care about the role playing side of it unless it's super interesting, like there's some really cool plot going on that they can sink their teeth into. They want to have fights. That's what they're there for. And I have players who love to get around, like get in and roll around in their character and really express themselves in character. And it's fun no matter what. But you do have to kind of set that expectation. Not every interaction requires a conversation. I will often have characters who go shopping, right? And they say, I just want to pick up a longsword. If that's all they're looking for, like simple stuff like that, I don't need to role play through an encounter with that. I just can tell them, yeah, you can easily find that, subtract a couple of gold, like whatever the cost is for whatever they're getting, and move forward. That's it. That's all it takes. You don't have to do something like, in Critical Role where they stop by, I forget the name of the shop, but Pumat Soul or Glorious Godfrey. That's not right. Glorious. I can't remember his name. Maybe that is his name. I'm thinking of the DC character, though. DC Comics. But yeah, you don't need to role play out an entire conversation, and if it's important, do it. If it's not, skip it. You don't need to fill time just to fill time. That's not necessary. But you and your players should determine like how much role playing do you want and how much board gaming do you want, and you'll fairly quickly settle on what everybody at the table is into. You'll kind of get the feel for it, but just be ready to not have a specific expectation when you start, because this is all new. The last thing I want to say is, if you are the GM, don't ever, don't get so stuck on feeling like you're a player that you won't allow your villains to lose. This is a horrible, horrible habit that some people get into, and I've played with people who do this over the years, where they cannot let their bad guys lose. I probably go too far the other way, where my assumption is the bad guy is always going to lose when the players run into them, and if they get away, then I can do something else. So encounters, for me, have to be built so that if I need to advance the plot, it needs to advance whether the villains succeed or fail on whatever is going on currently in the game. And again, that gets pretty complicated when it comes to making the heroes the star of the game, making sure they can do things, but also making sure the villains can advance their plot. And you can kind of see how the story aspect of things really can get pretty complicated in a role-playing game, because you do need to keep advancing the plot until there's a an appropriate buildup of tension that then you can release by having the bad guys succeed or fail, hopefully fail. Um, but don't make your bad guys your good guys, because they're the bad guys to the players, and the players are the ones who should be winning. um, if the bad guys happen to win, good dice rolls on their part or bad dice rolls on the heroes' parts, you need to be able to have an idea of what they do with the heroes if the villains win. Do they just kill them? That doesn't sound like a very satisfying end to a game. It might be realistic, but it's not very fun. Um, if, however, you've run the game and the heroes lose all the time, and finally at the end the villains capture them, and you say, okay, the villains have you captured, what do you guys want to do? And their response is, they can just kill us. That means you've not run a very good game, because the players don't want to keep playing. They're like, yeah, fine, we got beaten. We always get beaten. We have nothing, like, whatever, let's just do something new. You need to make the players feel like they're important, and they need to actually be important to the overall plot, because they need to be able to trust that what you're doing is including them in a story that they are at the center of, that you want to keep telling. They have to trust that if you capture them, you're going to give them a way out, not because it's narratively convenient, but because they matter. They are the heroes. They need to get out in order to rescue whoever they were going to rescue, save the world, do whatever they were going to do, find that important magic item. So let your villains be villains. Let them die. If they need to get away, if you need them to get away, guess what? You're the GM. They can just get away. Oh, he had Dimension Door. He had Teleport. He had whatever. You can do that. Gets a little more complicated when counter spells involved, but hey, there you go. And that's everything for today. So let me see if I can run through these quickly. Do a session 0. If you're not confident in your ability to handle a session 0, do a session 0.5, as I suggested. Pre-written adventures aren't going to get you that player-centered sort of adventure that you see on things like Critical Role. So if you want that sort of interaction at the table, you're going to have to manufacture that. Just keep it in mind. Make sure your players and everybody at the table understands what the setting is like, the morality, the races and classes that are allowed, the feats that are allowed. If they get anything special that you've added to the game, maybe everybody starts with, their own feat. You can do that. It wouldn't be horribly unbalancing. Maybe everybody starts with a cantrip from any spell school that they want. There's any number of things you can do to customize your setting. What races and classes are available? Are you specializing anything in that regard? Are any of the characters unique with regards to their race or class? How do you want to run the game in terms of open world versus closed world? Can somebody else jump in and say, hey, I want to run a game. Can we just use the same characters and we'll use this setting? Are you cool with that? I highly recommend it, especially for new players. How much board game are you playing versus how much theater are you playing? And again, you'll kind of get a sense of that. And then finally, don't make your villains your personal heroes, like that they have to win all the time. Those are my next top tips after the initial ones that I gave for brand new GMs. So if you've been playing for a little while or you want a little more advice, this is the stuff you want to listen to. There you go. I hope that's helpful. Coming up, I'm going to do another section or another episode on more advanced GM tips that I'm coming up with right now. Kind of making notes on things. I've got 3 or 4 here already. I'm going to do something about running for younger players and how that is a little bit different than running for adults. And also, I wanted to do something about optional rules that I think are really good to consider including, not necessarily including. I also want to do an episode about what's good about Critical Role, and I've touched on some of these things as we've been talking, but there's absolutely more. And also want to do something on kind of DM tips on how to handle encounters, how to build encounters, how to handle monsters, and planning versus improvising on all of that. So stick around. Feel free to let me know if there's anything you would like to hear about. I hope this was useful. Oh, this was supposed to be my image for don't make your villains the heroes. Strahd is a good example of a character that's super, super popular, but you know what? Ultimately, if things go well, Strahd has to lose. And that's kind of the way it's supposed to be, because they set him up as this completely evil, nobody can beat him except your players, and that's what makes it so cool. So remember all those things. They're things you'll learn over time, but it's super useful to hear them, especially early on, and especially if you're just learning, because you can kind of think about some of these things even before you really need to worry about introducing them or worrying about them. Just think about them, see what you can work into your games, and I hope it goes well. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you need anything from me. My email address is in the description. You can also leave comments below. Thank you for watching this. Oh, I've been off to the side this whole time. I wasn't able to see my video. Thanks very much. Stand by for adventure.